Welcome back. This is video 2 of 5 of our Swift midterm solution where you built an iOS app we called Olivander's Wand. So let's code on, you wizards of Swift. Next up, use a separate .swift file to create a project-wide struct that you will use to hold the data for each individual spell. Name the struct spell data, upper camel case, because it is in fact a type. And the struct should contain 3 properties, name, description, and sound file for the appropriate name, spell description, and the name of the sound file that will play. I like to put my models just above my view controller, so I'm going to right-click on SceneDelegate.swift, select New File. It's a Swift file. There is no spell data master class to subclass. Click on Next, then name that file spell data upper camel case and click create. And inside our new file, struct, name it spell data upper camel case, same as the file name, open and close curlies. And inside we'll put those 3 properties, var name :string, var description :string, and var sound file :string. Then we're going to create a separate project-wide class file to hold the data on spells. We'll call this class spells with a capital S, and the class file will contain an array of spell data named spell array. So I'm going to right-click on spell data, new file, create new Swift file. Next, we're going to call this spells with a capital S because we're defining a new class, which is a type. Click create. Then inside this function, class, capital S spells, open and close curlies. And to declare this array of spell data, we're going to say var, lower camel case spell array, colon, and then in between square brackets, upper camel case spell data. That's the type that we just defined as our last struct. And then we're going to set this equal to open and close brackets. So we're initializing it to an empty array of spell data. Now part C, we want to modify viewcontroller.swift to use the spells class. So since we've created the spells class, we want to modify viewcontroller.swift, changing the declaration of spells from a string array that we just used to test our table view to an instance of the spells class. And we want to modify the table view code so that it works with this newly defined spells variable. Although at this point, if we build and run, the table view is going to contain no data. It'll eventually show the name of every spell. So this is super easy. Over in viewcontroller.swift, I'm going to click in the line that has my first definition of spells. I'm going to command / to comment that out. I could delete it right away, but underneath that I'm going to say var spells equals, and then capital spells, open and close parens. We'll initialize that as well as declare it. Then down here in my extension, wherever I refer to spells, I now want to refer to spells dot spell array. So down here in cell for row at, I'll say spells.spellArray, and then remember I want to pass in the element dot name at the end. Now why didn't we just create an array of type spell data? Why did we put it inside of a spells class? Because we're going to put a get data inside of the spells class, and we want to get all of the array elements at once, not just one at a time. So doing it this way will allow us to package our data access inside of our model, and that's a pretty good MVC design. And then up here in number of rows and section, I'm also going to say spells.spellArray. .count. If you want, you can build and run just to make sure that you don't have any errors. We see there are no errors, but there's nothing in the table view. Let's get some data. So part D is all about accessing data using an API call. If you visit this particular URL, and I'll copy and paste it, we can examine the JSON, leave that open in a browser so we can go back and forth to reference it. We want to add a property in spells named URL that holds a string equal to the URL for the Potter spells above. So if I head over to the web, paste that URL in, I can see my JSON. I can see that I have one key that's returned, and inside is the value of another array. We can see that we've got 42 elements or 42 different spells in here, and we can see that we've got keys for the different properties that we want to fill in our spell data. We've got a description, we've got a sound file, we've got a spell name, looking good. So back in spells.swift, right underneath where we declare and initialize our spells array, we're going to declare our URL variable. So we'll say var URL equals, and then in between double quotes, I'll paste in the value of the URL that I'd copied from the exam. Now, next up, we want to add a method named getData to our spells class, and the getData method should retrieve JSON from the address in the URL and pass the appropriate data into the spell array, which will have an element of spell data for every single spell. Now, in the way that we've been learning how to access data via JSON, we've already written a getData function that uses URL session. It accepts a value called URL, which is the URL of the API, and we can reuse a significant portion of what we've already written. Now, normally, when you're learning things, I want you to type everything out. But on this exam, to make an exception, because you're all in quarantine, we haven't had a whole lot of time together, you're able to open up previous code examples and use some code that you've already got working there. So let's get some data. So one of the things you can do is you can actually go into your Pokédex project, open up the Pokemon data.swift file. We can copy our get data function out from there, then return to our wand project and paste it into our spells.swift file. Now we're going to have to make some changes in here. And again, under most circumstances, I absolutely do not recommend that you just copy and paste code from one source into another source. When you're learning, you really want to make sure that you understand what each line is doing. But since we want to accomplish a lot in a short period of time, copying and pasting is something I'm going to let roll for this particular exam that we're doing in quarantine. And in fact, up to this point, this is the fourth app that you've written that has API access. We started out with Weather Gift. You access data in your Pokédex. You access data in your Game of Thrones Houses app. And now we're doing it with our Harry Potter app. Hopefully, you've really got these concepts down. If you ever need a refresher, you can go back into Weather Gift or the Pokemon app and review how we broke down get data and what each line does. So with this JSON, we don't have any page JSON, we don't have any API keys, but I am going to go down to the do catch clause after we decode our JSON, and I'm going to highlight and comment these 3 lines here, which were specific to the Pokédex. I'll delete them in a bit, but it's nice to have them here for reference. Now in our Pokédex, we returned data into a private struct that we created that we named returned. And we created this struct to conform to the JSON so that we could decode it. Now, if we look at the JSON that's returned by Potter Spells, all of our data can be found inside of a single key named results. And then we see the value of results as an array. And in fact, the 3 values that we want have the same key names as the same 3 properties in our spell data struct. So we can use this as part of the data structure that we want to use for decoding. But we still need to get things into a results property, which we can say will be an array of type spell data. Now, we also need to make sure that spell data is codable conforming so that we can use it for JSON decoding. But this is looking pretty similar to what we've done before. So we're going to create a struct. We could name it anything, but returned is a good name. It's the same name we used in our Pokédex example. So we'll say private struct capital return because it's a type, colon codable because we're decoding JSON, open and close curlies, and then inside, since the JSON that we want has results as the first key value, we're going to say var results spelled exactly the same way, colon, and then the type that we can decode into is going to be bracket spell data close bracket, which means it's an array of spell data. And we'll say equal open and close square bracket to initialize this to an empty array. Now we need to make sure that spell data is codable, but let's head down here and print out what we have for returned. So in our do catch clause, we're already decoding returned, which is the struct that we just created. We're decoding this into a variable called returned. Let's print out returned just so that we can make sure that we're getting the JSON. And my indentation is a little off, so I'm going to Command A, Control I, and now I'll enter print 3 stars, returned JSON is colon, and then string interp returned. So that'll just print out all of my JSON to the console. Now remember, we need to call getData, otherwise this function's never going to run. We'll do that in viewController.swift. We'll do it inside of view.didLoad. So I'll say spells.getData. Xcode adds the curlies, and what's in between these curlies will run when the getData function hits the completed statement. And we still need to update the spell array before we can show anything on the table view. And before we do that, we're just going to print out to the console. But while we're here, we'll write the code so that we can update the table view when we finally update spell array. So to do that, we'll need to put that inside dispatchqueue.main.async. Xcode adds the curlies. And if we didn't do this, we'd get the purple crash. Why? After we get all the data, we want to call tableview.reloadData because getData happens on a background thread, but anything we do with the user interface needs to run on the main thread, and updating the table view is part of the user interface. So inside in the main queue, we're going to say self.tableview.reloadData, and when we try to build and run, we see that we get a crash here. And it's saying that spells.return does not conform to the protocol decodable. And the reason for that, remember I said that we have to make sure that spell data is codable? Well, we didn't do that. So this is the error that could show up if you try to decode into something that you haven't set as codable. And every struct that you're trying to decode in has to be codable, not just this first one returned. But see how we have spell data inside? That's got to be decodable too. The reason why I leave these errors in here is because they're common, but when they occur, Xcode doesn't provide a lot of feedback to you as a programmer. But no, if you see this, that means something isn't codable. So we'll just click on spell data and we'll add colon codable right after it. Boom, problem solved. Let's build and run and see what we get in the console. We're still not going to see anything inside of our table view because in get data, while we've decoded our JSON, we haven't taken data out of the array and put it inside of our spells array yet. But if we take a look down at the JSON that's printing the console, it looks good. I can click in the lower right-hand corner to hide the variable inspector and give my console more room, but it looks like all of my JSON is printing out perfectly. Let's get that data into our spell array so it can be shown in our table view. So we're still on question 9. We created our method getData in the spells class. GetData is grabbing the JSON, but we haven't put it inside a spell array, so we need to finish that. We've actually already written the code for number 10, though. We put our dispatch_queue.main.async, and then inside of that, we updated the table view with a tableview.reload data. So let's just finish parsing our data into spell array. So back in our spells class, inside of our getData function, down in the do_try_catch area, we can delete the print statement and the 3 things that we commented out earlier. And then all we need to do to parse this out further is to say self.spellArray, that's what we want to fill up, equals returned.results. Now if we option click on results, we can see, hey, that's an array of spell data. And if we option click on spell array, we can say, hey, that's an array of spell data too. Perfect. We take our returned results, that's a structure we needed to have in order to read our JSON, and we assign it into spells array, which puts our array right at the first level so that it's easy to access and display in our table view. Build and run, and look at that, we got all of our Harry Potter spells. Nice work. In the next video, we'll review how you set up the spell detail view controller.